Welcome to Elevate UPLIFT's Community Dialogue Series, centering healing advocacy and services. The Elevate UPLIFT project seeks to deepen and broaden the lessons learned from the National Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative project and engage with organizations to change practices and expand their understanding of healing. Elevate UPLIFT offers opportunities to help survivor-serving agencies, state, territorial, tribal coalitions, and funding administrators to think critically about how they do their work and to make the changes necessary to provide comprehensive and sustainable support for survivors. That includes establishing practices and services rooted in anti-racism and anti-oppression frameworks, learning strategies for building empowering leadership, creating intentional organizational identity, engaging in impactful community organizing and movement building, and expanding knowledge of sexual violence and healing.
Please join me welcoming Olga Trujillo, who is going to be our presenter today. Olga.
Great. Thanks, Guadalupe. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's always very exciting for me to see people signing up for and attending trainings on dissociative identity disorder. It's my passion to kind of help people understand what it is and why it's important to know what it is and how to work with someone who might have it. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of walk you through our discussion today, and it might be a little more me talking and a little less you all talking today. And then next week, we're gonna look into healing-centered, using a healing-centered approach in your work, and it'll build on a little bit of what we talk about today here. So I want to kind of let you know what to expect before I get started, and then I'll get going. I'm going to talk about dissociative identity disorder, DID, from a lived experience. So I was diagnosed with it when I was 31 years old, and I want to show you through my story of finding out that I have it, and then going through a healing process. I wanted to show you kind of what DID is, bring in some of the research on it, and then give you a sense of what it feels like to have it, the healing process, and then what you can do to help people who have it. So I'm not going to talk about specific incidents of violence or anything like that. I'm actually going to just kind of talk about the point at which I found out I had it, and then from there, how I learned more about it. I will mention a little bit about what happened to me, like how it was that it was developed, but not much at all. So I'm hoping that it won't be triggering for anyone. Okay, so let me just check if you could go to your chat box and tell me yes or no whether you have worked with someone or known someone that has had DID, or dissociative identity disorder. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so a lot more people than I had thought who have worked with someone or know someone that have it. Awesome. Cool. Okay. So is there anyone listening in today, any of the participants, that has never heard of DID? So if you can write in the chat, yes, for never heard of it. Okay. So it sounds like everyone has heard of it because I'm not seeing any new entries into the chat. Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, that helps. So I'm going to kind of get us going. So I wrote a book that came out in 2011 called The Sum of My Parts. And this is a book about about my experience of DID. The first half of the book is how I developed DID and lived with it. And the second half of the book is in detail about the healing process and a little bit about my life now. So there's way more information in the book, but this is kind of where I'm drawing a lot of my material from. Okay, so I was 31 years old, and I was the youngest general counsel at the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. And I was married, and I was doing really well in my career. I had just, my husband and I at the time just bought a house, and my world was probably the safest it had ever been without me even realizing that it was the safest I had ever been. And then we went to go see a movie, and the beginning of that movie had what I thought was a really vivid attempted sexual assault. And I had what I thought was a panic attack. And then we left the theater, I went home, and I kept having a sense of panic and pain and a weird thought that something like what happened in that movie happened to me. So I called the DC Rape Crisis Center, and they helped me to understand that it is possible to have experienced something like that and not remember it. That it's possible that a scene in a movie could bring that up for me and still not remember. And then they helped me to calm down and to get grounded. What I didn't know at the time was that that movie triggered me, and I was experiencing a flashback from a time that I had been raped. And so I called them off and on that weekend because I kept re-experiencing that flashback, and they helped me get grounded and stay grounded off and on during that weekend. Okay. I went to see the DC Rape Crisis Center. I went in and met with an advocate that next week, and they referred me to a therapist that I worked with for a little while. And then she referred me, because I wasn't feeling like the therapy was really helping me. And really what it was is she had figured out that I had DID, but didn't tell me that that's what she thought I had, but was working with me as if I had that. And I could see her, she would talk to me as if I was different people. And then I would panic because I couldn't figure out why she was doing that. And I would withdraw in my therapy sessions. And after a while, I realized that like therapy really shouldn't be like that. So I had asked her if she could refer me to someone else. And so then she referred me to this guy that I'll introduce as soon as we switch interpretation. Cool. Okay, so this is Dr. Richard Sheffitz. This is a picture of us when I was finishing up my work with him. And Rich is a psychiatrist who had when I first started seeing him, he was 41 and I was 31, which I always thought was kind of interesting because he was just 10 years older than me. And I felt like I was really, really lucky to be referred to him and to work with him, and also to be able to afford to pay for the care. Rich turned out in 2015, he wrote this book, which I can never remember the name of, even when I'm looking at it. But the thing that I thought was most, the thing that kind of stands for me is the fear of feeling real. That this book is considered the Bible for other clinicians working with people with DID. And there's something that Rich does that's different in his work than what the standard is. So he's kind of value added to the standard. And I'm going to walk you through, I'm not going to go in as much detail about the healing process, but one of the things that I think is important is for people to know what the healing process can look like for someone that has DID, just in case you're working with someone who has DID and they're talking to you about their process of healing. It's just good to have a sense of whether it's the kind of thing that makes sense or not, because there are some clinicians out there that aren't as good, and it's helpful if you know whether something sounds right or not. Okay. So the first thing that we did in our work together was what the first therapist didn't do, which was that Rich started to talk to me about DID, what it was, why he thought I had it, and what it might feel like inside. And that is what enabled me to then start doing the work, because I needed to know what the signs and symptoms of DID were so that I could figure out whether that fit for me or not. And when I first found out, I was really freaked out about it and didn't want anyone to know. And then I started to find myself in some of the signs and symptoms. So I want to show you this video. This is a video, I really, really like this video. It does two things for me. One is it's about what the experience of DID is like. It's about a 8-minute video. It has people who have DID talking about their experience. It's a real short clip that's from a documentary project. So I'm going to fast forward through the very beginning of it because that's an appeal for funding for this documentary. And then I'll get it going once it starts. The other thing that I like about this video is you'll see kind of who has been identified as someone that has DID. And I'll come back to that at the end. So it just gives you an idea of what groups of people tend to know that they have DID. Okay, so here we go. Hopefully everybody will be able to hear it okay.
My name is Ron Dave.
And we'll fast forward through this because Ron's a really great guy, but he talks a long time about why he's doing this film. And we'll go right there.
Bad movies portray this disorder as the ground out of which murderers emerge and torturers emerge.
We couldn't possibly be normal or have normal lives or jobs or children that are functioning.
They thought if I prayed more or if I had another baptism, that these spirits would just be released from my body.
Someplace between 3 and 9 million Americans have this disorder.
It could be anyone. It could be the person sitting next to you.
We have DID.
I am we. We have DID. I am we.
Hi, welcome to Healing Together. Here's your name tag. And then this is the folder that has your agenda. DID is an acronym that stands for Dissociative Identity Disorder. Most people in the past called it multiple personality disorder. It's one word of a difference, but it's a big difference. We're not multiple people. We're one person with multiple parts. And I think the new name reflects that better. Everybody has a social self, a work self, a weekend self, a husband self, a wife self. Everyone has self states. People with dissociative identity disorder, they dissociate those states. So instead of being congruent and all aligned, they're separated. So while your work self will know your home self, will know your school self, you'll be all interconnected. People who dissociate have those selves, but they don't communicate with each other.
Different people have different labels for how they view their system. For example, a person may look at their system as their people, whereas someone else may say my parts, whereas another person may say my personalities.
Each individual person held an integral part of my life. I have a part that was a secret keeper, a part that helped me in school achieve straight A's, a part that is my protector, that when boundaries are crossed, you will know. For me, it's easy to live with voices inside. The hard part is accepting the reality. This is why I have it.
Many of these patients who prominently experience dissociative symptoms have had the experience of chronic childhood abuse and neglect during their early years. And that's a key. DID is a trauma disorder, similar, if you will, to post-traumatic stress disorder. Most folks with DID also have post-traumatic stress disorder. Study after study after study has shown that people with dissociative identity disorder report histories of very traumatic childhoods, sexual abuse, physical abuse, a lot of neglect. And what happens is when children are being abused at a certain window of vulnerability age, between about maybe 4 and 7 or 8, when children are still forming their identities and have this sort of capacity to imagine not being themselves, some children make use of this capacity and personify these difficult thoughts and feelings, so that when I get angry, it's not me, I'm a good little girl. It's a boy and his name is, Rascal or something. And he can come out and be mad when I can't be. It is an internal sense of self that feels very disconnected. It feels very other because it feels too dangerous for those thoughts and those feelings to be integrated into your sense of identity.
There are huge blocks in their memory that just don't exist. Could be hours, could be days even. So there's amnesia for the time that other personalities are out.
When this happens over and over and over again, it becomes your way of being. It continues to feel real. DID doesn't go away with the pill. DID takes many years of slow and careful treatment to try to help people reintegrate back these aspects of self, asking themselves the question, what purposes do these parts of me serve? Which is hard.
There's times that I've been frightened of my people. They wanted to hurt me for a long time. Therapy has been one of the greatest things that we have ever done. I would like all of you to come close to me. Enjoy this with me. Some of my people that were the most scary just needed love and understanding. And when we started working in that direction, everything started to change. I want to learn about them. They all have different interests, different hobbies, different skill sets. They saved my life for years.
The narrative of Willow's life has holes in it because the different people hold on to different memories. So she does not have a cohesive, coherent timeline of her life. The goal of her therapy is to be able to put the pieces together to make sense of the things that she went through, so she has the same story as her people, and her people have the same story as her.
My name is Ron Davis, and
Sorry about that. Okay, so I wanted to stop for a second. We're going to go into kind of what DID is, but there's a couple of things I wanted to reflect on that film. I love that film because it's not exploiting what the symptoms of DID are, which is what a lot of films do about DID. Instead, they're talking about the causes and what it might feel like for someone who has it. I also like the way that therapist at the end talks about the therapeutic process. The therapeutic process is about getting to know the parts inside and learning to work together and having a narrative about what your life was like. You don't have to remember everything. You don't have to go through everything. And you don't have to get rid of people or parts. That's really, really important because there are still therapists out there that will tell people that their goal for their therapy should be integration. And I'm putting that in quotes, integration, meaning that parts go away. And that makes it very, very difficult for people. I mean, one, a lot of people don't want to get rid of their parts and don't really need to if they can learn to work together. And that's a really big deal in the DID field. That sense of the person going in determines what their goal is in therapy. And even if they go to therapy, because there's a lot of people who don't go and don't feel that they need to go because of all kinds of reasons. One, starting with financial, and two, because they've been misdiagnosed so many times and given medications that didn't work and constrained and all kinds of issues. And so their feelings about mental health care are really compromised. And then there's also the thing that therapy is a very mainstream experience. And that's the thing that I wanted to point out about the movie. If you notice there, most everyone in that film was white. There are a few people of color there, but that's a big conference for a DID conference. There's 300 and 400 people that go to that conference each year. And really like 90% are people who, and I think of it this way, that white people generally, or people in our society where things are, when things are made for you, then you have the luxury of exploring some of the challenges that you might be experiencing. And if you are a person of color, if you, the more and more you live at the intersections, the more and more you have to deal with to address some of the issues that you might be challenged with. I'm a Latina, and I was raised in a Latina home, but also by someone who internalized a lot of the racism that she experienced. So I also grew up very mainstream, and it was really difficult to be able to say that there was, and to acknowledge that there was something that I was struggling with that was so hard, because I was already trying to fit in a white world where I wasn't white. So that's an element of this, and we're going to talk about that next week during our healing-centered approach dialogue. But I just kind of wanted to lay that out there, and I'll mention a little bit about that as I go along to show you the ways in which it can create gaps for people. But so let's everybody ground ourselves on what DID is. So DID, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder, is a severe psychiatric condition that is strongly correlated with a history of chronic and unremitting child abuse that's characterized by identity alteration or confusion. So basically what that means is that, and I want to rephrase this because this is the stuff that I'm pulling out of research and books. DID is an incredibly creative, adaptive approach to really, really awful stuff that's not normal, which is the abuse that people find, that people perpetrate on kids. It's, and that's the key, is to think about the people that you're working with. If you suspect they have DID, or if they know and have told you they have DID, or people in your lives that you know that have DID, if you look at them as someone who used an incredibly creative, adaptive approach to surviving some really awful stuff that happened to them, then you're going to treat them differently. And this is what I want you to think about with survivors.
Can we have an interpretation pause, please?
Thank you.
You're good. No, you're good. You're doing awesome.
And then Guadalupe, can you also check in with them that I'm not going too fast? Because I get kind of...
Yes.
Okay.
You're doing great.
Thank you. Okay, awesome. So DID is a disorder, as we heard in that video. It's a disorder that forms as a result of ongoing trauma in childhood. And it's almost always some sort of abuse that's happening. Now, in order to create parts, you have to have a creativity of creating imaginary friends, and that tends to stop happening. You have that, basically, I like to call it a superpower, until you're about the age of 8 or 9. And the thing that's so amazingly adaptive about DID is that it provides an escape for people cognitively when there is no escape physically. And this was totally the case in my situation. I grew up in a home with a father who perpetrated violence against my mom, sexually abused me, physically abused all of us, verbally abused all of us, and then my brothers also sexually abused me. So that was a home that I could not physically escape from, but I could cognitively escape from the abuse that was happening in my home and to me. A person that has DID feels as if they have inside them 2 or more entities, each with their own way of thinking and remembering about themselves and their life. So in that video where the therapist at the end talks about Willow, and what Willow is trying to do is to have the same narrative of what happened to her, and the same sense of remembering about her life that the people she has created have. So I'll just say from my experience, when I first went into the healing process, there was so much I didn't remember and didn't know, but parts of me did. And so I had to slowly, painstakingly engage those parts and learn and accept that those things happened to me. All right. By the way, if you have questions, I would love for you to put them in the chat any point along the way, any question at all. It can be curiosity questions about me and where I'm at. It could be the specific slide that I'm on, anything at all that you want to know. This is a rare opportunity, I think, to meet someone, virtually meet someone who will tell you they have DID, who's done a lot of healing work around it, has brought this into, I've brought this into my work, I've written about it, I've thought a lot about this. So I'm happy to try to respond to any questions that come up for your work and your life. So DID is in the DSM-5, which is how clinicians can diagnose people and then get paid to do the work that they've done. Okay, so this video right here is a 2-minute video that has a really beautiful illustration of how DID happens. And I like to show this because a lot of people learn and remember things visually, and so I want to show you this. The woman that's talking has DID, and this is the European film, so you may need a little bit of adjustment to her accent.
In a sufficiently safe environment that is sensitive to child's needs, the human personality develops wholly. In other words, life experiences are integrated into the consciousness. When trauma occurs in childhood, that is when the nervous system is going through a phase of rapid development, it always results in a dissociative disorder of some degree. This means that the traumatizing experiences must be separated from everything else. In other words, the personality is divided, dissociated, and the traumatic experience is encapsulated. The part that is carrying the traumatic experience is called EP, emotional part of the personality. Because the unbearable experience has been separated from the personality, it is no longer whole. Therefore, the remaining part is called ANP, apparently normal part of the personality. The main purpose for the ANP is to keep on living as if nothing ever happened, and the encapsulated EP is stuck in the trauma time. The more chronic traumatization and dissociation is, the more complicated the fragmentation of the personality structure will become. One part may bear the pain experience or the physical feeling. The second part carries the picture of the event, and the third part the sound. One cannot recall the traumatic memory by will, but it is triggered by reminder of the trauma. Usually, the traumatic memory is triggered just partially. Some fragment of it reaches the consciousness. Sometimes it might activate wholly. This is called a flashback. Depending on how early the traumatization begins and the severity of it, the greater the likelihood is that the ANP is also divided. The Dissociative Identity Disorder, also called as DID, means that there are more than one ANP sharing the everyday life of the individual.
Okay, so I love that because I really appreciate the visual of how things are created. So let me kind of also state that with respect to my experience. I'm gonna move to the next slide. Okay, so when I was in the healing process and I started meeting the parts that I had created, I started counting how many parts I had. And I had ANPs, which I didn't use that term, that apparently normal part. For me, I called those full-fledged parts. So they were, they had an age. For me, they were all me, which is a little unusual. They were all me at different ages, except for one. One part was a turtle that I created for protection. And I remember actually creating that part of me one summer in the backyard because we had a box turtle in our backyard. And I spent days and days sitting outside and hanging out with the box turtle, probably torturing it, not intentionally, but touching its head and watching it pull into its shell and then waiting for it to come back out and then touching its head again. So I was kind of exploring kind of what it would be like to have a turtle inside. So I had, by the time that I stopped counting, meaning I had more parts, more than this number, but it got to be so much that it scared me, so I stopped counting. I had 120 parts, and that's not unusual. We don't hear of people having that many parts because generally people don't tell you how many parts they have. And we hear about, just 2 parts or like in Sybil, 16 parts or something like that. But lots and lots of people that I meet all over the country, all over the world, have way more than that when they first find out. Now, the way mine were broken out is that A and P, or what I call like full-fledged parts, were 20 of them. And those were me at different ages. And I might have, like, for example, 2 of those parts that were the same age, but they had different roles. Okay, so I had 20 of those, and then I had of the EPs over 100. And the EPs were those fragments. That's how I referred to them. These are fragmented parts. Now, they still felt very real, and they had a different analysis of things than I did. They had different information, but those were the fragments of what led me to the bigger memory, because those would be the things that I'd be looking at or hearing or smelling or, again, all throughout my senses. There were also parts that were fragment because they had one role only. And that for a lot of people with DID, and this was true for me too, I had lots and lots of parts that were fragments that their role was simply to commit suicide so that I don't learn about the things that happened to me. And that's a really common experience for people with DID. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of an inside-out experience of dissociation and DID. Actually, before I do that, let me just check. Are we good on interpretation change?
We got like 2 minutes before the break, so I don't know.
Okay, let me go ahead and answer this question and then we'll go first. So I have a question here. It's a really, really good question. And I'm not sure I'm gonna have a good answer, but let's see. Is DID developed over prolonged dissociative events over a number of years? Or is DID diagnosed due to the severity of the abuse and isolated to the individual? So it's not usually one event that creates DID. It's usually a series of events and trauma, because there's no escaping it, that then the person starts to create parts. So my first part, for example, was when I was 3 years old. Now, for me to have the kind of trauma response where I would dissociate and create a part says that there was a fair amount of abuse that happened before I was 3. But that's my first memories of abuse. So my sense is that one incident by itself doesn't usually cause DID, and it's a cumulative, but you get to a certain point where then you start creating parts as your way of coping. So I hope that helps to answer. And then are we good for the switch for interpretation?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that right now.
Thanks. See, this is what happens is I start getting really focused on the interpretation. Okay, so let's go through an inside-out experience. So I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Inside Out. It was extraordinary to me. It's a Pixar film, and it's supposed to be about a child, and I think an adolescent kind of learning to feel feelings and how their memory works and everything. This film was like, I remember sitting there watching it. I'm like, oh my God, this is so much like what it's like, except for lots and lots more parts. And the parts there were lots of parts like this in this film, like you have, these parts all have different kinds of emotions and feelings. And that's basically how in this movie they split it out. But a person that has DID will have a lot more than that, even just on emotions and feelings, and then other parts as well. And they would be, oftentimes people have different genders, animals, inanimate objects, all kinds of different, really, really creative parts. So, okay, how it feels. So for lots of people, you'll hear people talk about hearing voices. And this is oftentimes why some people are misdiagnosed as being schizophrenic, but it's not. It's voices inside your head and not outside. For me, I think because the parts that I created were all me, I didn't hear voices, I heard thoughts. And it was constant. And what I learned to do was to stop paying attention to the thoughts that were happening in my head, because there were so many and going all the time that it was overwhelming. So what I eventually started to do was just not listen to any thoughts that I was having. So then the next thing that kind of comes up, you feel really busy inside. So you have a lot going on inside. So I'm trying to remember a good way to describe this. Still today, I'll have issues like this when I'm having a hard time and something throws me off. So this is the kind of thing that would happen to me. Like I want to say this week, for example, we're in the middle of a really, really hard time in our country, right? We've got a pandemic going on. We have economic crisis happening. We have a racial crisis happening. We have a political crisis happening. I mean, and on and on. And so then when all that is happening, I feel a tremendous amount of anxiety around this, and I'm coping the best I can. And then something happens in my life that I don't expect. And this will start happening to me again, where I'll feel lots and lots of thoughts happening all of a sudden, and I'll feel really busy inside because the parts start getting really active. So I've learned to pay attention to that and pay attention to those thoughts and try to center myself and calm things down and take control over the things that I can, and then let go of the other things. But a lot of people haven't done the level of work that I've done in terms of healing and might not have this all like figured out. So when they're talking to you about hearing voices, when they're talking to you about not being able to think because there's so much going on inside, think about this kind of situation as a possibility. A lot of times you feel very chaotic because when those things are happening in your head, you don't feel like you can concentrate, focus, or be proactive. So you're constantly reacting to things. And so being very reactive will feel hard, but it's also all you know, because that's the way that you move through the world when you have DID and you don't know that it's any different than anyone else. Oh yeah, that's a good question, Guadalupe. What is my favorite thing to do to keep me centered? So it depends on what it is that's creating an issue for me. I'm really good at wanting to have a mind-body connection. So I used to run. I don't do that anymore. I've been riding my bike more now, and that really helps me a lot. Also, sitting with my dogs and just kind of hanging with them, it helps me to stay grounded. There's something about petting them or walking them, and it depends on what I'm struggling with. If I'm triggered, then I'm not going to feel as safe outside. So then I might do stuff inside with the dogs to try to center myself. And then eventually I'll feel safer and I'll go out. or I might ask my partner to go with me, like to walk the dogs, and that'll usually help. That's a really good question. So it's a very kind of reactive experience, and it's very, very hard to concentrate. It's hard to read. It's hard to comprehend what you're reading. And then also there's a sense of detachment from your body. So I felt forever, up until I was 31 years old, like I wasn't really in my body except when I was playing sports. When I was playing sports or running or doing exercise, I could feel my body, but the rest of the time I felt like I was over my body or behind it or around it. And I didn't know that that was different. I had changing perceptions of people and surroundings, and this is in part because I would change, right? I would switch from one part to another, and that would sometimes be because of what was happening around me didn't feel safe, so I would switch. Also because a lot of people that grow up with abuse have this as well. I have trust issues, so I listen to what people say and I watch what they do. And if those two things don't add up, then I start to question whether they're trustworthy. But I do it in my head. I don't share that with them. And then eventually I find enough things that don't add up, and then my sense of that person changes. So then all of a sudden I don't trust someone that I'm close to. So that's something that I know happens to me. So I try to pay really close attention to that. And I try to address it with the people in my life that where this might be happening. And I'll just be really honest. It's very hard to live up to standards where you have to do everything you say you're going to do. Lots and lots of people don't intend to deceive. They say things because it's aspirational. But I'll hear it and then I'll think, okay, that's what they're going to do. And so when they don't, then I start having trouble with that. And I've learned over the years to be able to decipher between things that people hope to do and things that people say they're going to do, like important things that they say they're going to do. There's a difference. So it used to be hard for me when my partner would say, I'm going to clean the house, and she wouldn't clean the house. Now I know, well, that's just aspirational. It's not a big deal. But it's different when she says she's going to have my back, and then all of a sudden she doesn't have my back. That's the kind of thing that I'll start losing trust on. It feels like you're incapable of doing anything because you can't focus, because you can't concentrate, because you can't plan, because you have, you're going in like a million different directions in your head. So that means that things that are easier for other people are harder for you. And you don't know why, because you don't know that the way your brain works is different. And oftentimes the DID creates amnesia so that you don't remember what happened to you, which is what helps you survive it. But then you hold yourself to a higher standard and you feel bad about yourself all the time. When in fact, you're a friggin' superhero and you don't know it. So you can't, it's really hard to control your thoughts. I've learned to do that. I still sometimes am challenged with that, but for the most part, I'm really good at it now. It's really hard to control the disconnected feelings, which is usually because of the dissociation that happens. People who have DID live in dissociation, meaning that they've learned to not feel things. So remember Rich's book, The Fear of Feeling Real? That's what dissociation creates, is you survive the world by not feeling anything. So you dissociate a lot. When anything comes up that's hard, that makes you angry, that makes you sad, that makes something more difficult, any kind of intense feelings, you dissociate as a norm. And I had to learn what dissociation was, what it felt like, figure out when I do it, stop myself, and change the conditions that created that need to dissociate. Okay, so I'm about to start another 2-minute film that talks about healing. Is that good? Okay. All right. So again, this is that same group of people. It's a really beautiful visual. And I think it's kind of one of the easiest ways to visualize what's required in healing for someone that has DID. Now, it's not required to have therapy, but there is a need for being able to talk about what happened to you and have someone witness it. Doesn't mean that it has to be therapy. They say that it's therapy. So let's go from there.
For trauma recovery, we need another person and verbal sharing, i.e. therapy. There are different stages in trauma treatment. Successful treatment takes time, inevitably. First, you must build enough trust and safety. Safety is the most important condition for a successful treatment of trauma. The treatment must include a corrective emotional experience that you don't have to be alone with your problems anymore. Achieving realization does not mean that one should rewind and relive the traumatic events again and again, but by encountering the part that was born due to the traumatic event and by exploring the emotions and sensations that they are holding, we can gradually obtain the level of trust and safety that are needed for healing to occur. It is important to be seen as all the parts. Thus, the shift from trauma time to the present is possible, and slowly the symptoms will recede. Realization is an automatic response to the experience of safety. Realization or defragmentation means that life experiences and personality characteristics return to the rest of the personality structure, thus forming a more wholesome self and obtaining healthy control over one's life and choices. Trauma is always accompanied by a strong experience of seclusion. Peer support plays an important role in the realization process. It is an important stage in the journey to recovery. At its best, it is possible to find one's own tribe through peer work, which is essential to a herd animal like we humans are. Trauma can be healed.
Okay, so I like this because of the illustration that it shows you and that it lays out some key things that are important to healing, like safety and stability, and someone that can hear, that can be a witness to your pain, to the things that you're remembering. Okay, so what research has shown, and this is kind of where Rich went and had this value added. So what research has shown is that people with DID who go through a process of healing that involves therapy will have a reduction in the symptoms. But the therapeutic process needs to involve focus on safety and stability, basically 3 phases. 1 is focus on safety and stability, 2, processing of trauma, and 3, a rehabilitation. And these aren't the best words, but it's basically learning how to live anew, like with what you know about yourself.
Can we have an interpretation pause, please?
Yes. Awesome. And I should say that you may hear some dog noises. I have a dog behind me who all of a sudden decided that he is the happiest thing on the planet and is rolling around. making some noises. So hopefully that won't be too disruptive. Okay, so I like this 3-phase approach. And that is, if you know someone who's in a therapeutic process, that's basically what it should look like. They create safety and stability and build the therapeutic relationship. They go through meeting the parts and learning about what their roles are and what happened. And then they, as you learn more and more and accept more and more, you go through what does this mean for you now? Like now that you have a full sense of the things that you went through, what does that mean for your life? How do you feel again? How do you express anger? How do you all these different things? And that's that rehabilitation stage. And then when people are in that, it doesn't happen in a neat box, right? You don't have safety and stability and then move to trauma processing and then move to rehabilitation. It actually goes back and forth, because that processing of trauma can destabilize someone. So you got to go back to safety. Now, you can do this, people can experience this without having to do a therapeutic process. Like, there are things in our world that help people to feel safe and stable and to process trauma and to try to figure out what they do with themselves without it being talk therapy. And there's lots of examples of that in cultural communities that have not really been explored for healing for people with DID, because we have a very mainstream model. And I don't mean to criticize it, because I benefited from that model. It's the best thing I ever did was to get help when I needed it. But I also went through a model that was for someone who was not a Latina. I went through a model as if I was white, but I'm not white. And so there was a lot left, a lot of healing left. And that was very, very expensive. And a lot of people can't afford that. And a lot of people don't get the kind of therapeutic help that I got, because it's hard to find. And again, it's very expensive. So I just kind of want to show you what the process looks like in case people are in it and you're hearing about it. But it doesn't mean that this is the only way that people heal. But if you hear someone in a therapeutic process that sounds really, really different than this, then explore who that person is that they're working with. Reach out to me. I know people all over the country that do this work. I can check in about whether that's the way to go or not. And so I'm not sure if I'm making it more confusing. So the thing that Rich did, actually, I want to go back one, and then Val, I'm going to get to your question. The thing that Rich did that was really important, and what I think, and which is what I'm going to bring up next time, is that most people that can afford therapeutic care that go under this model don't ever leave therapy. And the reason is because you become very, very reliant on the therapist that you're working with to feel grounded, supported, to help you move through the world. What Rich did was he added connections in each of the phases. So in the first phase, he built connections between him and myself, which was around the relationship building and trust building, and then also examined what connections I had in my life that he could help strengthen. And then where else could we build connections? And then in the stage of around trauma processing, when I'm meeting the parts, he built connections among the parts. And that made it much easier for me to be able to move through the world as if I was one, because I have collaboration and cohesion inside. They talk to each other. They know about each other. And so when I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do, I get a vote inside as to, yep, this sounds okay. I can do this. And it's very instantaneous now. And then the last stage around rehabilitation, what do you do in the world? Rich is focusing on connections for me with people I work with people in my chosen family as opposed to my my blood family, with friends, any connections that I have, he helps me to focus on and build. And so then I can leave therapy and live a life managing my DID and moving through the world as if I'm one, even though I'm not one. And that's the big difference. And the way the therapeutic process works, and this sounds way more complicated than it actually is, but it's psychosocial therapy, which involves cognitive behavior therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, and what I call part work, which is the trauma processing. And Rich, because he was as skilled as he is, also used hypnosis to help me to distance from the memories so I could stop dissociating. And so I could also learn what dissociation felt like and learn how to ground myself so that I wouldn't do that all the time. He also helped me with hypnosis to contain memories between sessions. And then at the very end, he helped me to connect this way of, like I had a tremendous amount of anger and rage. And so when someone crossed a boundary, I would get angry rather than freeze, which was my response. And then also there was art therapy, body work, mindfulness practice. And then I had to learn how to get the emotions out that I had learned to hide and stuff. So this is typically what a therapeutic process looks like, and those 3 phases. Okay, so I'm showing you all this because there are things that you can do when when you know people who have DID and are going through the process. So I'm gonna move us ahead. I also have research on this about the fact that DID is real, but here I want to talk about what you can do. So 1, learn more about DID. I have fact versus fiction research, learn from people who have it on the impact on their lives, learn about the healing process, which you just did. Share with your colleagues and others, your multidisciplinary teams, other people in your community, healthcare providers, about DID. It's real. These are the ways that it can show up for somebody. And then try to find people out there that can help people who have it. Then the other thing is, if you're working with someone who has DID, help them to be proactive. Okay, and I'll show you kind of a little bit how to do that. So this is on the learning I have. So if you want to learn more about DID, email me, which I'll put my email in the chat, because I have lots and lots of material on it. Okay. And there we go. That's my email. Okay. So for mental health practitioners, to learn more about DID, to listen for it, which is those gaps in people. So something that happened that might be related to a trigger that may have caused flashbacks, and then someone who has gaps in memory that doesn't come from normal memory. So for example, I didn't remember any of my childhood that happened in our home. I remembered things in school. I remember being with friends, but not being in my house. So that's not normal, okay? Or somebody might not remember anything that happened when they were 8 years old, something like that. That's not normal. Then consider DID as a possibility. A lot of people don't know what it is, so they don't think that it could be that. And then people are misdiagnosed and mistreated. And then make sure that you have clinicians in your area, if you are going to refer someone to that work on trauma and dissociation, not just trauma, because trauma therapists don't always know about dissociation, and the therapy that you do for someone who has PTSD because of trauma as an adult can make things worse for someone who has DID. Am I okay, Guadalupe? Okay. Cool.
Yep.
All right, so we talked about the healing process. Okay, I want to help clients to be proactive. All right, so first, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And healthcare is really hard for people who have parts. And a lot of healthcare professionals don't know about DID or don't believe in it. But if someone ends up in an emergency room because they have COVID-19 or because someone close to them has it, they might start switching and they'll look like a person with DID that's having a hard time, which the healthcare profession might not be familiar with. And they may then think there's something really wrong with this person and move to have them put into their psych unit. So talk with people that you know about a plan for what they would do if they get sick. I created, this is an example, this isn't the one that I created. I created DID emergency information cards like this in case of an emergency that talks about what the disorder is and what to do, someone to call and what not to do. So I can send that to you if you'd like. I think Val has those as a handout. But create a card. It'd be great if you could put your organization logo and name on it to give it credibility for when they give it to someone. And again, I'm happy to help you think through how to do that. And then I have a healthcare guide that you'll have as well that will walk a person through kind of preparing for healthcare crisis. And they can use that for any other type of crisis as well. It doesn't have to be COVID-19, but healthcare is a really hard thing and the healthcare system is hard to maneuver when you have DID. Share with others that DID exists and what they can do to help. And then when you're working with someone and you're doing safety planning, you may need to break the steps down quite a bit, repeat things over and over again, keep it simple, talk about dissociation, when they dissociate, how they ground themselves. There's a tremendous amount of things that you can do to help people to kind of get grounded. And I have some materials that I'm happy to send you about grounding exercises that people can do. You can work with other advocates to practice it if you haven't done it before, and you can teach people who are dissociating a lot how to get grounded. Also, you can talk with, if a person tells you they have DID, when you're doing safety planning, you can talk with them about how everyone inside might need to work together to be able to pull this off. And what do they need from you to do that? And then the more and more you do this, the more and more this will be what they do. And then, so I'm going to stop there. Well, actually, I kind of wanted, there's one more thing I wanted to tell you. Here we go. Make things as predictable as possible. Okay, plan ahead, because it helps for everybody. It helps for people with DID, it helps for people with autism, it helps people with other mental health issues to make things as predictable as possible. So that requires you planning ahead to kind of break down what somebody might have to go through in order to do something they need to do. Limiting stimulation, giving them things in different modes of communication. Like I showed you videos that have diagrams in them, as well as telling you about my experience and having things written out. That's what you want to do with people who have DID to help them remember. Okay, so I'll stop there because I know we're out of time, right?
Well, we did start a little late, so I don't want to cut off any important information, especially any helpful information. I also want to be respectful of time, but we are recording, so if you have some more things to share, I think if people need to jump off, they can do that. Valerie sent in the chat that all the handouts that Olga is referring to will be attached to the follow-up email with an eval and the PowerPoint. So if people need to leave for whatever reasons, and then maybe we can just finish up.
Yeah, and that'll be great, because Val had this really great question earlier about DID and dissociation being on a spectrum, right? So we do. So my DID is different than what Jamie in the video, the first video I showed you, she talked about how people have all these different parts, but those parts for normal people we call, I'll just say lovingly, we call you all singletons, because you don't have the superpower of having parts. So singletons don't have barriers between their parts, right? Everybody talks to each other. It's very cohesive. People with DID, she said, don't do that. They're not all aligned. They don't have communication. So I had a mix of parts that did communicate with each other and parts that didn't communicate with each other. And that was because I created an enormous amount of parts to help me function every day. And most people just create parts that are keeping the abuse from them. So that was a little bit different. Okay, so there is this kind of spectrum of dissociation that involves DID. So one end of the spectrum is normal dissociation, which everybody does. So somebody drives to work and they forget the ride. That's dissociation. It's totally normal. You might be stressed out. Someone's reading a book and loses track of what's going on around them, or watching a movie and loses track. That's all dissociation that's normal. Then there are people who will dissociate more and not track what's going on around them. So their memories are impaired because of that. It's not because they're being abused. There might be stressful things happening around them, which is why they might check out. But it's not a creating parts kind of situation. So right now, it's hard for a lot of people with all these crises. So more and more people might be dissociating. And they might not remember all the things that are happening in their home right now. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It just means that's the way they're coping through this. And that's actually a really good thing that they're coping. Then there's people that create parts, right? Well, so that happens if you were abused before the ages of 8 or 9. And there are varying levels on the spectrum of whether parts talk to each other with co-consciousness, the way mine did, most of mine did. And then there are people who are what I call fractured, which is they have parts that don't know about each other, they don't talk to each other, and they lose track of time. And that's a really big, significant thing, is when someone loses track of time. And that's amnesia that happens. And that happened to me when I was a kid, right? Those times that there were gaps in my memory, in my home, I lost track of those because I created parts that I didn't know about and that didn't share information with me. So people can be somewhere along that spectrum. They could have what's known as otherwise not specified dissociative disorder, which means that they dissociate a lot as a way of coping, but they don't create parts. So again, all this is very, very creative adaptations to what's happening in someone's life. And then there's, someone could have DID where they created parts and don't have any communication. So that's kind of the spectrum. I hope that makes sense. I feel like whenever I talk about DID, like I know what I'm talking about, and I never know if I'm presenting it in a way that is easy to understand. So anyway, so if you have questions. All right, so I do have a question. Sorry, go ahead, Guadalupe.
Go ahead. There was a question I was going to say. I didn't know if you've seen it or not by Mary.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I saw that there's a question here asking if I think or feel that my parts will ever meld and become one. I don't know. Okay, so I'm going to stop share for a minute because I want you to see, this is the only way I can talk about where I am right now. All right. So I had a whole bunch of parts. The parts of me that experienced that abuse that I didn't know about, most of them aren't completely gone, but pretty much gone. So it's a little bit like this. Like I feel like I'm in a huddle with my parts. So I can see, if you can see me, I've got my hands joined together, right? My fingers all connected. So they're all connected, but there's still a little bit of separateness to them. So what that means to me is that in that healing process, I became cohesive. And so those parts that were abused, that held on to that information so I didn't know, most of those don't need to be separate anymore. And they're just kind of hanging out like this. Now, if something really bad happened, like a re-traumatization happened, I could splinter off again. That's the piece of it that I still have DID. And then I have two parts that are more separate than others. And one of them is really because I love this part. When I was 3 years old and I spent days with my next door neighbor, who was this amazing, loving person, I wanted to remember that I could feel the way I felt when I was with her. So I walked through her house, imagining words that I couldn't spell, floating through the air, and I kept grabbing them and holding on with this. And at night, I would lay under my bed when I got scared, and I would hold my fists to my ear and open them, and I would feel like I felt when I was with my neighbor. And I was creating a part that would remind me that there was good in the world. And I still have that part. It's not like it's a little more separate than this. It's kind of the two thumbs here. It's a part of me that's still out there, not completely separate, but still separate, that reminds me that there's good in the world. And then there's a part of me that is very protective. And that's that part that Rich helped me create when I was leaving therapy, so that when someone crossed a boundary, I could use anger to stop them, because my go-to response was freeze instead of fight. So that's where I'm at. And it's possible that I'll meld more together, but for the most part, that's how I've been for many years. And the thing that I work towards is to not splinter off, to always pay attention to my thoughts and how I'm feeling, so that I move through the world as though I am one. So I'm going to stop there. And I think this is the big chunk of information that I wanted folks to learn. And I will then next week, during the Healing Centered Engagement, I'm going to come back to some of this and show you the gaps in healing that weren't addressed and where that left me, and then kind of talk to you about an approach that is healing centered and not so much trauma centered, which is a little bit different.
You've been listening and viewing Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue Series. Elevate Uplift is supported by a collective of national organizations and Circle of Wisdom members leading anti-sexual violence work and includes the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, the National Organization of Asians and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the Resource Sharing Project, and our Circle of Wisdom members who provide us with direction, expertise, connections, and influence. For more information, please visit www.elevateuplift.org.